Welcome to the Strength Athlete Podcast, episode number 23. We are very excited today. There's a couple fun subjects for us to talk about. Self-limiting exercise has been a fun topic that's been on a lot of people's minds and in a lot of people's mouths lately. But in addition to that, we wanted to talk a little bit about the IPF Classic World Championships that are coming up. With us today, we do have Bryce Krawczyk from Canada and Calgary Barbell representing the 105 kilo class at Open Worlds. You can't see it on the iTunes version, but he is waving there. But you can say what's up, Bryce, and we got Eric and Bryce Lewis here as well.
Howdy.
Hey, how's it going? Silent type over there.
No, we usually get a little yo. Quick shout out to the sponsor of the Strength Athlete Podcast. That's going to be SBD USA. We have partnered with them to give you guys free shipping on an order of any size. That can be from a pair of socks up to 10 sets of knee sleeves. All you have to do is go to their website and use the coupon code SBDTSA in all capital letters, no spaces. If you want to read a little bit more about our relationship with them, you can go ahead and go to sbd-usa.com/TSA, I believe, is the link for that. I could be wrong on that, but I'm right on the coupon code. The coupon code is definitely all capital letters, SBD USA, without the hyphen, like the website. So branching off from there, let's talk about Worlds. Bryce, when I say Bryce, I'm going to say Bryce K or Bryce, just to be clear, because we have Bryce K. How's it going to feel to beat Bryce Lewis at Worlds?
Hitting hard on the opening questions.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess we'll see what happens. We were even talking game day plans here. I don't think either of us are planning to try to come out on top by keeping secrets. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to lift everything I can, and obviously Bryce will too. And I honestly would rather place in a lower rank and put together a better performance than kind of come out on top because somebody miffed something or something. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just looking forward to hopefully being a part of a really cool and entertaining class and seeing a bunch of big lifts smashed and then drinking some beers afterwards.
Hell yeah.
I'm in for that.
I think year over year, the 105 class in terms of men just keeps on being the most interesting, because I mean, this year right now, realistically, if Bryce misses one lift, a squat or a deadlift, if Christoph misses a deadlift, if Blevins misses a squat, and Kuvumbayev misses a lift, there's 5 of you contending for first place. If everybody misses one lift, which is not that far reaching, and so it's pretty darn cool. And I'm sure there's somebody else who's going to be coming out of the woodwork too. There's athletes who aren't even competing in the open. Eric is a huge fan of Rondell Hunt from Trinidad, and that guy is just an absolute monster. I mean, it's a good thing he isn't in the open, because he'd probably win.
Yeah, he's got a chance to total 900 kilos as a junior, which is insane.
Yeah, it's bananas.
Pretty crazy.
That's cool. So aside from the 105s, obviously that's the class that you guys are probably most interested in, since you're both competing in it. Do you guys have a particular class or gender that you prefer to watch in lifting?
Sorry, go ahead, Bryce.
There's just a few people coming from USA that I haven't seen lift at Raw Worlds yet that I really want to see. So Charles Akpelko's come in. This will be Russell Orhi's first time at Worlds, and he's super strong and seems pretty confident when he steps out on the platform, and I kind of want to see what he does at a world competition. So yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to those individual performances. Bryce K, go for it, man.
I was just going to say, I think both the 72 and the 63 women are going to be super, super entertaining to watch. With Maria from Canada here and Isabella cutting down to 63, and obviously Jennifer Thompson. I think that's going to be incredibly contested. And in the 72s, we've got a Canadian in the top 3 nominations to Rhea Stim, who I'd really like to see do well. So that'll be interesting. I'm actually coaching a lifter in the 84 pluses, Haley Kostinuk, and super obviously excited to see what she can do. And yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of really great battles kind of throughout. I would echo your sentiments on seeing Russell and Gibbs go head to head. I think would be really, really cool. And also Luke Richardson in the 120 plus juniors, I think is is something I'm looking forward to seeing. Just how much weight he's going to put together. I think it's going to be pretty cool.
Can we take a minute and talk about how much of a disservice it is to the open 72 kilo class that Jessica Buettner isn't competing as an open?
Yeah, I think it'd be pretty damn cool to see her in there.
How's her nominated total compared to these other guys? And I know she's made a ton of progress recently.
It's going to be pretty interesting with her and Chloe Dublin from the U.S.
So she's in here with a 483 nominated total.
Jessica's super strong.
And she's had like linear progress since Canadian Nationals, and not low slope linear progress. I mean, she's probably put 10 kilos on her squat and 10 kilos on her deadlift, and minimum, and bench is a question mark. I'm sure there's something going on there. So that's just asinine progress rate for someone at her level.
Yeah, she's been hitting a lot of PRs.
And easy too. She deadlifted 217 or 218 kilos today in training for her last deadlift, I think, and it looked like she could have done 5.
Damn.
Yeah, so I would say she'd at least be in the run for the podium, and kind of like in the mix with everybody, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even her listed nominated total puts her 4th among the open athletes, and we're saying she's making progress. But obviously, so is everyone else. So, and further caveat, it just depends on what you do on the day.
Absolutely, big time.
I've got to say, I think you brought up a good point with the 63 kilo women there, Bryce K. Isabella is probably the biggest question mark of the entire competition, in my opinion, because her, you look at her strength levels in the gym, and she could take a 10% hit on what she's projected for and still total more than the projected winner of the 63 kilo class right now. But that weight cut is a question mark. It's, when you're dealing with that kind of weight cut where someone's been dieting heavily for months leading into a competition, and in addition is water cutting several kilos off their body weight to make it into the comp, the attempt selection becomes somewhat finicky. So it'll be interesting to see how they put it together. I'm hoping, I think conservatively, based on what she's done in the gym, I think it's right there. I think first place is within her reach if she can keep most of that strength.
Yeah, I think and she's one of those people who's so lean to start off with. Like she was lean 72.
Yeah.
And now she's like club shreds.
Yeah,
and then some.
And probably 65 right now too, with a little little ways to go.
I think she's even above 65 right now.
Yeah.
But if she can survive the water cut and bring like even a 200 squat, a 100 bench, and then be able to pretty much pull what she needs, somewhere around 220 or more.
She just switched to sumo too, hey?
She did. She did.
It's been an interesting transition to watch.
Finally cheating like the rest of us.
Annie and I were talking the other day. We were thinking the winning total is probably going to be around 500, 505, something like that.
Yeah, it's 10 kilos up from nominated, so that kind of...
If Isabella's going into deadlifts with a 300 subtotal, she might be above that 505 on an opener deadlift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think Sam Calhoun has a good shot for that as well. She has a huge total coming out of the Arnold, and if she put 2.5 kilos on her bench and 5 on squat and deadlift, she's right there as well, over that 500 mark. So it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be a fun class to watch. And then obviously Maria coming out of Canada, if she can hold on to that third deadlift or maybe even second deadlift, if she can hold on to all of her deadlifts, she's right there because she has just such a monstrous squat. She's an absolute beast.
Well, taking a look at the squats specifically, we're almost positive to see that world record get broken, possibly on a second attempt, depending on how things go. And I know I was up there in Canada at Canadian Nationals, and T made her third attempt look comfortable. So I'm excited to see what they'll put in for a third this time.
Yeah, she's another one of those lifters that just seems to be continually and consistently making progress, and everything just looks comfortable and pretty easy and smooth, and then she puts 10 kilos on it the next time she comes out, so it'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's because she made that meatball transformation like Bryce Lewis. Like the whole 93 to 105 transformation.
My goal is to be the opposite of Isabella von Weissenberg.
The exact opposite transformation.
Yeah.
Yes, aspires to be Ray Lewis. Do it. No, but speaking of, did I say Ray Lewis? I meant to say Ray Williams.
Well, I thought you were combining the two of us.
Well, that works. That's kind of a middle point on body structure. If you've seen Ray Lewis, just add some murder to the equation, and it's just...
There's an open spot in 120s for you now, Bryce.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. It's something I've toyed with, but I don't know if
both prices.
I don't know if I'm ready to commit to that. I don't know if my I don't know what quality of life would be like at 120 for me.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a lot of eating.
Like, exactly. You know, I sympathize with guys like Kelly Branton who like need to force feed themselves up a class. Like that's commitment of a whole different kind than it takes to get in the gym 4 days a week and train your ass off.
Absolutely.
I think I'd be willing to make that sacrifice if I were in that position for country, you know, just strictly for patriotism.
You can do it right now.
Change your job description to sportsman, though.
Yeah, like actually, some of you who haven't seen in person at Worlds, they typically have a projector board, and on the projector board it shows the lifter's name and maybe a quirky fact about them, and then it has their profession. And it seems like in Eastern Europe, and maybe it's just the communist countries or former communist countries, their profession is sportsman. It's like their whole job. They get paid to lift, which is nuts. I mean, that's cool. It's I mean, I kind of wish that kind of life was possible for us basic gym girls in the US and in Canada, but you know, it's only when you are part of a sport that fills seats, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like you know, when the national pride is there, it's totally different. You know, like people don't talk about powerlifting on the street here in the US or Canada. They would talk about soccer or basketball or whatever the case may be.
Well, there's going to be tens of people in attendance at Worlds this year.
So it's a full house.
It's a tough location to get to. I mean, Calgary is it's very convenient for you, Bryce, obviously, but
right there.
For the people who are all around the world, I mean, this is nice. It's a North American location. It's easy for all the U.S. lifters to get to, maybe one or two of their close relatives. But for people beyond that, it's, you know, the Calgary airport, I think, is a small airport, so it's not a cheap place to fly to.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not on par. I think Edmonton's a little bit more of a hub. But yeah, I don't know.
We also neglected to mention the 52 and the 57 kilo classes. I think those are both going to be super interesting as well. Marissa Inda is coming in nominated in third, despite being the reigning world champion, and Joy Damane has looked awesome her last couple of competitions at 57. It was like something clicked, and all of a sudden her squat just picked up like crazy, along with her bench is still the weakest of the bunch, but certainly right there enough to build her total with that gigantic deadlift.
That was a huge deadlift,
yeah, it is. And Jennifer Milliken, the clear front runner for 57s, and you know, I say this every year, I'm confident she'll win. But the Ecuadorian Kenya Monserrate and then Ina Filimonova, who bombed out last year, surely will be coming back looking for some vengeance, if you will, or restoration of her own reputation. It's got to feel terrible to bomb out. I think it was on bench actually, after having such a long and illustrious history of good competitions. I think she was reigning world champ for a few years running.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she bombed on the bench.
Yeah, I think it was her. Well, it was obviously her opener. But so moving beyond that, let's talk a little bit about self-limiting exercise. And I think this is something that Bryce K, I've seen you make posts about it recently. It's something I'm a big fan of. There's a lot of uses for it, be it for injury prevention, injury restoration, or for athletes who are pursuing something else concurrently with powerlifting. Myself as an example of that currently. There's a lot of ways that we can utilize these sorts of exercises in an effective manner to build a training protocol that suits your needs. So, Bryce, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just so that all our listeners are on the same page. Start us off with a definition of what we mean by self-limiting.
Okay, so more or less what all of us are aiming for with powerlifting training is to improve the competition lifts. That is the fundamental tenet of what any powerlifting program is aiming to accomplish, is to increase your barbell back squat, to increase your barbell flat bench press, and to increase your competition stance deadlift. Now, at all times, all year round, it's not really feasible, possible, or enjoyable to train exclusively those lifts. So how do we allow ourselves to become better at those lifts without necessarily having to train at those super high intensities all the time? We start to talk a little bit about training variations, and there's a broad array of variations for each individual lift. So, from the squat alone, you could probably name 10 variations off the top of the top of your head without really having to think all that hard. Now, some of those are intentionally going to be used in a manner to limit the weight that is on the bar, or to limit the particular stresses on a part of the range of motion for whatever your reason may be. Maybe you specifically want to use less weight because you want your training to be less challenging. Maybe you specifically want to unload a particular part of the range of motion. Whatever it may be, these self-limiting exercises allow us to train that movement pattern to get some stimulus in that way, while also limiting the absolute load on the bar and thus reducing risk for injury in general, as well as reducing bodily stress.
Cool. So we've got kind of a working definition here that we can go forward. And it's not that it makes it necessarily easier, because, a set of 5 at RPE 9 is going to be set at RPE 9 if we're talking about squats or safety bar squats or pause squats or whatever. But since there's less load on the barbell overall, it decreases maybe joint loading or Bryce K, what's your take on this?
So I think most of the reason that I would use self-limiting exercises in the case of like pause squat and pin squat and other variations, a lot of the times is for a motor learning benefit. I'm trying to teach the athlete something by forcing them to perform the movement in a specific way, where if they perform the movement in correcting a fault or something that I'm trying to address, then they'll be rewarded by the lift being more efficient. Whereas if they perform it incorrectly, then they have immediate feedback and fall further into that fault and can tell, like, oh, I messed that up. I need to do this, this, and this better. I think another one of the uses is probably for getting around injury. I've noticed a lot of people with hip and back issues tend to get a little bit of relief out of doing something more akin to a high bar squat, front squat, safety bar squat, something like that, where the torso is a little more vertical. So. Sure. Yeah, I mean, you could go down the rabbit hole into individual uses, but yeah, I think that variation has a very sort of important role in most programming that I write anyways.
I think this is a disconnect that a lot of people have too, because it sounds like there's this background of information that you have that maybe someone who is a beginner or an intermediate doesn't have, as far as like which one of these variations do I tag to a specific purpose, either for myself or for someone else too. And the research certainly doesn't say a whole lot about when to use variations or how effective they are compared to other variations. So it's got to be somewhat frustrating for people to be like, well, I'm down with this. I want some exercise variation. Where do I go? What direction do I head in?
This actually stems off into a good question, Bodhorn. I think you'll be good to answer this. So, when picking these variations, and in general, when defining how we want to use variations in training, do you think that we should be aiming more at specific weakness correction, or should it be more for the motor learning? Typically, in my own training that I write, it's going to be more for motor learning than anything. But there are certainly applications where we're aiming at weaknesses, but I think you're less likely to get at those a lot of times. What do you think, Bodhorn?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's working around technical faults and trying to use variations that can fix that. Sometimes there's going to be an obvious muscular weakness, especially if you see like the low bar good morning type of squat. That might be something where you want to target the quads a little bit more with different isolations or different variations. But a lot of times we're working on correcting technical faults with the variations that we include. Another thing could be, if we're looking at somebody who's become, if we take the squat, for example, somebody who's become highly adapted to a high frequency of training, it might be something where we're mixing in some self-limiting variations so that they can still get a high number of lifts, but reduce some of the strain and some of the wear and tear from doing such a high frequency of the competition lift.
Let me make that more concrete. Just, like for a lot of people, low bar squatting hurts their shoulders, their biceps, or their hips or something like that, and it's just not the kind of thing that in an ideal circumstance you would want to train the lift 2 or 3 times a week or whatever your programming asks for, but your body simply says, nah, this is not going to happen. And so at that point you want to keep the number of lifts to a point where you can drive the movement, and you have to kind of substitute in some kind of variation.
Yeah, definitely.
So to build off of that, Obviously what we're trying to get at here is the whole idea of self-limitation, right? Where you're inherently preventing yourself from putting more weight on the bar. So, Bryce K, in your case specifically, the equipped squat, for example, is a variation of your competition lift currently, and that would not be a self-limiting variation, I think, for obvious reasons.
No, definitely
not by any stretch of the imagination. So, just to make it clear, typically variations where you can do more weight are not what we're talking about. So, an at parallel box squat, a lot of people can do a bunch more weight with something like that than they can do with a full depth competition barbell back squats. So now the question that I wanted to branch off to is, where do we draw the line in terms of lifts that become less that are less loading on the bar, right? Obviously this is kind of like these, you can also look at self-limiting exercises as regressions of the competition lift. So as we regress away from the competition lift and as our stimulus becomes less specific, at which point do we start to see that drop off of transfer, right? Because you can go from a low bar back squat to a high bar back squat to a safety bar squat to a front squat. And then you start, at that point, the load on the bar starts to become pretty low relative to your barbell back squat. For most people who aren't extremely adept in the front squat, who don't have a really stable front rack, you're looking at 50% or less of your barbell back squat max, and even less so what the training loads are going to be. And so, what do you guys think in terms of where we draw the line for what we use in training at least as a primary movement?
I honestly think this kind of like harkens back to I think a big sort of underlying tenet when you're going to be using variations, and that is being able to monitor or at least come up with some sort of system to be able to tell when variations are having an impact, and to be able to extract from training the ideas or the data necessary to say, okay, lifter A responds really well with pin squats, and I know when we put front squats in there that this happened with the lift, and even if it's anecdotal, and you've been able to identify like, oh, I feel so much more upright in my squats when I'm doing front squats on Wednesdays or whatever. And then just being able to have some kind of recording to be able to tell when the lifter's getting benefit from it. And I think that, obviously that's going to come down to an individual level, but being able to have those discussions and have that data to sort of back up your educated guesses, I think is sort of paramount to being able to figure out what's worth it and what you're going to get transference out of and what you're not.
That's you bring up a great point there. I'll let you go as soon as I say this, Bryce. The underlying concept that Bryce K was getting at there is track your training. Track what you're doing, look at what you incorporate in each block, and look at what works well. And you may not have a concrete reason for it aside from the fact that I did this and this together and my squat went up. And that's a perfectly acceptable reason. We had a really long and solid conversation with Mike Tushira about this on our last episode. So if you guys want to delve more into the whole idea of using training to determine training instead of using someone else's ideas to determine training, episode 22 of our podcast, Emerging Strategies with Mike Tushira, give that a listen. We talk a little bit about a tracking tool that RTS has made free, available online for free. And that's a super useful tool for anyone utilizing training of any kind. And once you learn how to use it, I think it can be pretty useful. Carry on, Bryce.
What I was just to get at is kind of trying to figure out when something is working for you, to bring up the lift that you actually care about, and when it's just bringing up the lift in question. Because almost always when you start with a new movement, you're going to be able to get better at it because you are getting more efficient at this new movement. You're getting stronger in this new way, probably a large degree of just muscular neuroefficiency. But I'm imagining kind of two ways to go about adding some new movement. One is you just replace your old lift entirely. And so you're no longer doing comp squats. You're just doing high bar or safety bar or something like that. And the other is you're kind of doing two concurrently. So you're doing a comp variation, and you've also got later in the week some other variation. And that way you can kind of see is my comp lift going up as well. So Bryce, in your experience, both in yourself and others, which of these two do you prefer and why?
Obviously, again, every answer is going to be it depends. But for most part, if I'm taking somebody away from a competition lift, that's going to be to try to address some sort of injury or more serious deficiency, some sort of purpose other than driving training and driving progress in those three lifts. And if I'm going to be using it concurrently, then that's going to be how I do it 90% of the time. There's very, very few programs where I'm going to be taking out a lifter's competition lifts, simply because I think that having them run concurrently is the only way, or the only, I think, efficient way to be able to tell if one's impacting the other. Of course, you could do a full cycle of chain suspended good mornings and then test your squat at the end and see if it helped. But then if it didn't, you're 6 weeks down the road and you haven't made any progress in your squat. So there's that to take into consideration.
I think that's where it can kind of be confusing when you look at your training in more of an acute sense, when you're including variations like that. Like, say you did a whole training block of just beltless variations, and then you go and you test your belted squat, and maybe just because you haven't practiced belted squats, they don't go that well. But maybe if you spent another training block after that of actually practicing that competition lift more, it might carry over better. So it's something where you kind of have to take a bigger picture approach to it, rather than looking at it in a single week or a couple weeks of training.
Right. And I think with anything, it's going to be identifying trends, right? Like,
right.
I know there's been a few times in my own training where Mike's put me through like a hypertrophy or a lower stress block, and that was somewhat productive, but I think more so the point was to kind of act as a sort of restorative stimulus. And then out of that, my next training block tends to be very, very productive after having a bit of a refresher block or an intentionally lower stress block. So yeah, I mean, the intent behind it obviously is going to dictate that, but there's use in saying, okay, starting to correlate like this block with these movements came before this very productive block. Maybe that had something to do with it too. Trying to look at it from kind of a number of different angles.
I'm going to echo what you said there with regards to most training blocks, including the competition movements. A couple people asked questions about, when is it appropriate to take out the competition movements entirely? And I would say, injury as an exception, almost never. Because you can fit the competition movements in some way, do a little bit of practice, and keep them in rotation all year round with very minimal recovery impact, right? So if you want to take your squat to a triple at RPE 6.5 or, 3.5 reps in the tank, that's a very low demand training set. And that gives you an opportunity to evaluate where your squat is at. You can start with some set and some estimated 1 rep max from that, and you can track that number throughout the course of your training cycle, and that can be how you determine whether or not these particular variations are effective or not. Or it can, you don't even have to use it for evaluative purposes. You can use some fixed load with some fixed increment week over week just to keep practice of that in, because Bryce and Eric brought up very valid points of, if you go through a whole training block not training your specific skill you're trying to improve, your ability to perform that is going to degrade regardless of beltless squats. You'll probably find 50% of people on the internet who will tell you that is the most valuable training tool they've ever used for their squat. But the fact of the matter is, if they did a whole cycle beltless and then just put the belt on, odds on they're just a little bit stronger in general. It's not because of the beltless squats. But once they get used to utilizing that belt again, that small margin of being stronger in general is going to make itself much more apparent. So although they might appear stronger immediately, they're probably much stronger than they're even realizing because of the fact that they're not practiced with the belt. And that's just one specific example that I think can apply to a lot of different variations of the lifts. But I definitely just wanted to echo what you were saying there. I think it's a great point. Very rarely, only in the case of injury am I taking all the competition movements out. And then, obviously we regress the lift all the way to a point where it's somewhere where you can do something comfortable and you're able to complete some variation of that lift without pain and be able to load that. And that's going to be far superior to not doing anything at all.
Yeah.
Let me bring up the opposite other end of the spectrum as well, just so we're kind of talking about the complete picture. If you have a lifter who you think moves well, so we're not really looking to correct movement deficiencies, there's no injuries, do you just keep in comp lifts, period? So, do you need to incorporate exercise variation is the question I'm asking.
I think Bryce, you go ahead first.
No, okay. Go ahead.
I think the short answer is no, you don't have to. However, there's some interesting studies out there. I think the meta study we saw was Greg Knuckles, who kind of put it all together, talking about training monotony. And this is a variable that actually relates to injury incidences where by performing just the same 3 lifts in training all the time and not ever having any variation or any novel stimulus in there, you're actually at a higher risk of injuring yourself. So including some degree of variation, not specifically for increasing, not specifically including the front squat for increasing your quad strength, but strictly including it to include some degree of variation in your training, can help to reduce your incidences of injury on squat related movements, and similarly on the bench press as well as the deadlift. I think the less you need to correct deficiencies, the less far departed you need to be from the competition movement. So maybe you could do something simple like the barbell back squat and the paused barbell back squat, and that would be enough variation to keep things kind of mixed up while also keeping specificity fairly high. But that's just one example there, obviously. Bryce, go ahead.
I was going to touch on something very similar, and that's just kind of I think that would almost be based on a personal analysis, or even like looking at somebody's psychology. Like, are they okay just doing 3 lifts and feeling like they're digging a ditch with a spoon? Or do they need some kind of, like you said, novel stimulus, and just sort of as it relates to just staleness in training? So I think variations have a good impact on that kind of stuff. But yeah, most of my sentiments were laid out really well by Hani there.
Taking it one step further there, let's say we look at the very elite levels of lifters. So both Bryces, this applies to both of you guys actually. If you were just doing the squat all the time, you're not going to be able to improve those rep ranges every training session. You want to. In theory, you should be able to, but the fact of the matter is you're so highly adapted to that movement pattern, you can't expect to add 5 or 10 pounds to your 6 rep squats for 4, 5, 6 weeks in a row. You might not even be able to do it for 3 weeks in a row. Whereas if we give you something like that you're not especially practiced in, like the beltless squat, like the pause squat, like let's say Bryce Lewis, for example, if we had you do the low bar squat, you'd be relatively terrible at these lifts. And so it would be an easy way for you to make progress. Or an easy way for you, not overall progress, but it would give you a measurable way to improve your numbers in training on a regular basis and give you something that was trainable and had return on investment that was immediately tangible.
Yeah. So
but it may not necessarily carry over, but it would at least be a novel stimulus.
That's exactly right. So I would get better at the lift, but it's a further question of whether getting better at that lift makes me better at what I really care about.
Right. And that's where the measurement comes into play and why we track, right? You may find that when you do low bar squats in conjunction or in conjunction, is that the word I want? With your high bar squat, that your high bar squat doesn't improve at all. But you may also find that if you use safety bar squats in conjunction with your high bar squats, that your high bar squat starts to feel better. You start to feel less stress because the loads are inherently lower, but you get a similar training effect without having to train heavy high bar squats all the time. So, oh man, I'm gonna use this. This is a great tool.
So that brings up a kind of an important reason that a lot of people use exercise variation, and it's the idea of no stone left unturned. That we want to exhaust all possibilities to make ourselves stronger. So one way is volume, intensity, frequency, but another key training variable is exercise variation. So, why don't I, in some kind of systematized way, try out all the variations I can, so that I know that I'm not losing out on progress? What are you guys' thoughts there?
Do they have a sound that we can use for eye rolling on the podcast? It's my immediate thought with that expression. But anyway, carry on, Bryce. You were about to jump in.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
It's just about kind of exercise variation and the idea that we don't want to leave stones unturned.
Oh, right. That's what I was going to say. So I think a very similar experiment like Mike kind of conducted with a number of his lifters recently with the big epidemic of 600 tempo work. And it was just that same kind of thing. I had a lot of people asking like, oh, is this the reason your squat's going well? Like, what's the exact purpose down to the mechanism at a like anatomical level? What's going on, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, we just wanted to see if we could do that and I could get stronger. The biggest thing was enough people did it and were successful. And there was some science to kind of back up why that might be happening. So we tried it out because we had a period of time and we wanted to see if that's something that could make me stronger. And it's that same kind of idea of it's another way of varying the lifts, right?
Yeah. I think exercise variation is this place where the art of coaching meets the science of coaching, because we don't really have evidence-backed reasons for choosing specific exercises. There's dozens, and it's probably it's not outside the realm of science. It would just, unfortunately, there's a lot of N=1 cases when it comes to exercise variation, such that something might, even though Bryce and I have similar totals, similar body weights, Wilks scores, experience, we might have vastly different experiences when it comes to adding in the same lift, and it's hard to come up with generalized information when it comes to that. But in theory, it's not outside of science. So, this is where some art comes in, and seeing how someone moves and seeing what the data shows you, and trying to come up with what you think might be a good call, and then just being okay with saying, well, I might be wrong.
Yeah.
Well, everybody wants a magic pill, right? This whole conversation reminded me of, the 600 tempo example. Number one, those are awful. Mike had me do those for a couple of weeks, and I did them wrong, and I did the 6-count tempo on the upward portion of the deadlift. It was horrible.
I don't know if that's worse or better, but it sounds very terrible.
Self-limiting in the extreme.
Yeah. Once you get done with Worlds, try to do that with some 30% of your max, Bryce, and you'll see it's like the hardest thing. I almost passed out on the second rep. But people look at that and they want the magic pill, right? It reminded me specifically of a few years back there was this study back when everybody was on bodybuilding.com. So this is more than a few years back, but this study came out regarding drinking onion juice to increase testosterone. And I actually pulled it up here, and the results in this rat study were that people who or rats that had 1 gram of onion per kilogram of body weight had their testosterone more than tripled. Wow. And so obviously everybody out there starts thinking, oh man, I got to start blending some onions, right? It didn't work. Number one, and it just ended up being terrible for everyone. And so it's just, that's just how the world is, right? So many people are sheep with their training and with how they approach things. And it's like, oh man, that looks good. I'll try that. And it just doesn't work out in their favor.
That's super interesting though. 'Cause I don't know, if you see especially some science, I think people are like, oh, science says X, therefore solid evidence, therefore I should do it. But it's in a rat model and maybe a low-powered study or whatever the case may be, and you end up eating onions and having fun with that.
For anyone who doesn't know, actually, there's a current study being done on exclusively 600 tempo training with onion juice intra-workout. Give it a shot. Triple testosterone, triple gains. It'll be great.
Actually, Hani, your comment about the tempo squats being done on the way up made me think about how low the load that you were using on that compared to your back squat had to have been. And kind of back to an earlier comment about what is the lowest of loads that we can get away with and still expect some kind of transference to the main lift, or like how broad of a movement is too broad.
Right, and that's a great question, and in that case, it was actually the deadlift for me, not the squat. And so I think the loads I was using were, it was probably somewhere around 55 or 60%. So it was pretty low, but it was almost like I was getting so much more work done with that I didn't do it for long enough to determine whether or not I was actually getting any transference there. It was a 1 or 2 week transitional phase where I was doing those, and I hated every minute of it. But it was. Yeah, it's a valid point, and I think in general that's going to be too low, but there's also very good applications for that if you want to give someone some restorative work for their connective tissues and get some blood flowing into all of their joints and essentially get some heavy stimulus without necessarily needing 100% relative intensity on the bar. Then that's a great way to do it, because in someone like you, Bryce, you can squat 700 pounds. If we put 350 on the bar and make you do a 10-count descent, it's going to get real hard real quick. And you're going to get some work out of that. But it's, I don't think that's going to make your back squat max go up, but I think you're at least going to retain your current ability. Your knees, your hips, your shoulders, well, not so much your shoulders, but your knees, your hips, probably going to start to feel a little bit better over the course of a few weeks, and then you can jump back into heavy training thereafter.
The one thing I wanted to say is that I think it's pretty easy to make movements difficult. Like if you wanted to, you can shorten rest times, you can increase tempo, you can add repetitions at some type of lower intensity. And it's not really difficulty we're chasing, it's how well does this improve my main lift? And that's kind of a little bit of a question mark for some of these exercise variations still. Otherwise everyone would have that thing that improves their comp squat, you know?
My take on that would be, I don't think there's going to be any major benefits to limiting the concentric speed on any lift unless you're trying to work around something like working around an injury and purposely making it as self-limiting as possible. But I think there are some benefits to tempoing the eccentric on certain lifts, especially if you're trying to work on positioning and things like that.
Because we naturally decrease the tempo anyways as the load gets heavier. You know, like we descend a little bit slower on our benches and squats when we are in higher intensities than we would at lower intensities.
I know a few people who would love to have words with you about that and tell you otherwise.
I wanted to talk about the sociological aspect here. Do you guys see any trends in exercise variation? Like, oh, this is the hot thing in summer 2018?
It's the pendulum, man. Mike talks about that all the time. The training pendulum. I saw you open your mouth to talk, Bryce. Do it.
I think that tempo example was one of those things for I don't know, a number of months there, and I actually ran into, there were some German lifters in the gym today, and one of the coaches was like, oh yeah, I saw this on your channel or whatever, so I'm trying it out. It seems to be working really well. But I think, yeah, like, so I think when you see people who are in the public eye start to do things more and more, and if you see that correlation there, I think that's when we start to see these kind of trends happening. And you know, what that's decided by probably varies from time to time, but it's it's like anything else. It's just exposures and popularity maybe in exercises.
Yeah, I've seen the same, and I wonder, you know, if we're getting any closer to understanding actually what exercises work for a specific reason. Because, you know, if we went back 20 years and kind of took a look at what exercises people were doing, I'm guessing the further back you go towards the 1970s, the more bodybuilding work was present as kind of like main exercise variations. It's like, okay, well, you do your heavy ass triple for the day, and then you go just hammer on bro machines for 2 hours or something like that.
Those guys lived the dream, huh?
I've actually had a number of lifters have a fair bit of success with that kind of training recently. Just a number of people that started lifting around the same time as me, Selena included, a couple of others from the gym who just kind of got into that sort of powerlifting burnout and are able to kind of maintain their strength, if not make slow progress, and still feel good about like going in and working hard on something that isn't just squatting or isn't just deadlifting. So I think you're getting into like psychological benefits there.
Yeah.
And just like enjoying training, I think is something that's going to drive progress on its own almost.
Yeah, Bryce.
We talk about this a lot. Psychological benefits are so valuable.
Yeah, it's kind of bridging off that. Just like seeing progress on something can be extremely motivating. Mm-hmm. And it can probably help adherence too. You're more excited to go in the gym in subsequent sessions, and there's less burnout too. So Hani mentioned a little bit about burnout and reducing injury rates earlier on. So I kind of echo those.
So talking a little more specifically here, when you guys introduce a variation, you know, you can use it for a block, you can use it for a full training cycle in preparation for a meet. What do you guys use to determine whether or if you're going to change it, and when you're going to change it if you do?
Personally, a lot of times I'll use something similar to Mike's emerging strategies model. So I'll use it for a given block and see the progress on the competition lift throughout the block. And that block will be based on the length of the athlete's specific time to peak. In other cases, I'll try to discern a sort of relative time to peak, a time where we're making enough progress, even with, you know, modulation in the sort of variables and training, and just try to get a lot of lifter feedback. I feel like lifter intuition in exercise variation is one of the biggest things that I trust. If they feel like they're performing their comp lifts better, if their comp lifts feel like they're progressing, and they feel like their progress on a variation is tied to that, then a lot of times that's good enough for me to put it in the playbook, if you will.
Yeah, there's something to be said there about physiology and psychology being interconnected, and I think that's been verified in studies enough times. And it's just, you know, it's largely about believing in yourself, that self-confidence, that positive outlook on what you're doing in training, looking forward to it instead of dreading it or not having any opinion on it is going to go so much further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you got coach buy-in. So, Coach Bryce K says, hey, athlete, I think this is, based on what we've seen so far, what's going to work best. What do you think? Athlete says, yes, I'm on board. So we kind of have both coach and athlete buy-in, and they're more likely to go into the training, doing what's expected of them, and then kind of seeing how things go from there.
Yeah.
Okay. Bryce, I wanted to get your take a little bit on where you got to where you are today. So as we've had a few conversations, you've told me that you've kind of gone through a few setbacks, some injuries and stuff like that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think exercise variation has been a big piece of how you kind of recovered and got back to where you are. Can you walk us through what that process has been like, both on kind of the coaching side and then both you in the gym?
So just a little bit of background, I guess. I started having some flare-ups with a sort of, I don't know, to this day, undiagnosed hip injury. Would have been about 3 years ago now. It was in my last training cycle leading up to the biggest squat that I've ever done that I still haven't been able to match, but I'm hopefully getting close to. So I squatted 315, and during that training cycle, I had just kind of a stabbing pain in my glute as I would lock out. And because of that, I wasn't able to squat like I normally would, so I tried out doing some high bar stuff, and that felt really good for, I don't know, maybe a year or two. And then I actually just kind of on a whim decided to widen my stance back up, and that felt better again. But yeah, so using some high bar stuff, some stuff where I was a little bit more upright, I switched to sumo, and that made a huge difference. I was getting a lot of pain pulling conventional, and switching to sumo I didn't have any pain. And definitely I think the tempo stuff and pause stuff and pin stuff, just finding variations where I could progress and not be in pain while maybe not making as much progress on my competition lift, because like I said, I'm still kind of getting back to where I once was, but I've seen a lot of progress in less specific movements throughout that period of time. So it's been, I think, constructive to help keep me, like you guys were saying, progressing in something while maybe my competition lift is very, very slow and steady.
Not to toot our horns too much, but I think one of the values of coaching specifically is some of this problem solving and kind of trying to find ways to unlock something to keep you progressing and stuff like that. And I have a feeling that Mike had kind of helped through some of this process as well, along with your input.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's like when things are going well, it's pretty easy to see what's on the page and do what's on the page, but it's when things aren't going well or not progressing as well as you'd like that the value of a second pair of eyes, I think, can really shine.
Totally. And I think, honestly, I think one of the biggest things has just been like trying to relearn how to squat, because it's very, very minute changes from rep to rep that'll cause a rep to go from painless to painful. And it's things like trying to finish my squat with my quads and making sure my tension isn't too far on the outsides of my feet, and just like little weird things like that set to set, where if I sent a set to Mike, he might not even be able to see, or I might not even be able to see on a video unless I'm looking very, very specifically at those few things. If I push my knee out too far, it hurts. If it stays in here, it's fine. And, tiny things like that. And yeah, like going back to the whole tempo thing, I do kind of slow my concentric right around the sticking point, because if I lock out one way it hurts, if I lock out a different way it feels a lot better. So trying to kind of control through the transition point and things like that.
Sweet. I think that about wraps us up.
Okay.
So Bryce, a huge thank you for joining us on this episode.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. It's always fun to talk about Worlds when it's coming up. Eric and I are traveling out there. Bryce, you're obviously already out there. That's what Calgary Barbell is. Believe it or not, it's located in Calgary.
In Calgary, yeah.
Did you know that? But Bryce Lewis will be joining us out there as well. One more quick shout out to the sponsor of the Strength Athlete Podcast, SBD USA. You can get all their equipment at sbd-usa.com. And you can use the coupon code for free shipping in all capitals, SBDTSA, without the hyphen like the website. Thanks again for listening. I am Hani Jazayrli. We got Bryce Lewis, Eric Bodhorn, and Bryce Krawczyk. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yep.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, sounds good.
And we're signing off from here.